who missed the first session, that will be in there. But we are excited with the number of people who registered for this event. Unfortunately, we can't have everybody. It was too many people registered, but so we are very excited. The numbers and the interest, and it shows that we're ready to see how this works for English learners and how we communicate across the tiers of services in our districts. So thank you, everybody.
Yes, and we are very excited to have all of you with us. And as you scroll through the participant list, you probably recognize a few names on here and your colleagues across the state. So you're probably wondering, who is this woman who keeps talking to me? My name is Carolyn Turner, and I am one of the Ohio Literacy Leads. I work out of the Cincinnati area out of State Support Team 13, but my main role is I work with the Department of Education on all things literacy. And as Dana said, in Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement, English learners are called out. They're woven throughout the plan. They're not an afterthought. And in fact, our plan really does stress that all learners in Ohio have the opportunity to grow their language and literacy skills. And so the other name you see on here on the screen is Michelle Alaya. She is my partner in crime. She's actually doing another presentation as we speak, but she is going to be joining us towards the end of the presentation. So you may be familiar with her. Our faces are across the state in a variety of different roles, and I may have interacted with a few of you at one time or another. But like I said, we are glad to have everyone here and learning right along with us, because this is a journey for everybody. Even I've been through this now several years. I learn something every single time. I either sit in a training or I prepare for a training. I love to present and share my knowledge with all of you. And that way you can then share it with your students and watch them learn and grow in their language and literacy skills. So we mentioned Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. It is an ever-evolving document. It is not a stagnant document. And as Dana mentioned, you can just Google Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. It's one of the first couple things that pops up. Click on that, read it. It's about a 50-page document. There are some appendices, but it really relates the vision that we have for all of Ohio's children across the state, not just for the children of Columbus or Cincinnati or Cleveland, but across our great state, our vision that we have. And so to achieve this vision of making sure that all children have the opportunity to grow their language and literacy skills, Ohio is using a very simple, seemingly simple framework called the Simple View of Reading to drive all literacy content, conversation, development, and organization of resources to support the state's comprehensive plan. We want to ensure that all learners are represented and supported through the language and literacy development continuum. Now that's going to include emergent, early, conventional, all the way up through the adolescent years. So our plan really is a birth to grade 12 plan. We want to ensure that we provide specific recommendations for learners having difficulty that are reading and writing. We want to enhance the partnerships among general education, special education, teachers of English language learners, so that all people have a voice in this process. And of course, we are enhancing the state's infrastructure as we speak so that all districts and schools are able to implement these practices. And we look at what we're doing from the state level, the regional level, the district level, all the way down to the classroom level. And so please remember that this plan is encompassing all learners. So when we look at our objectives for today, and we are only here for a very, very short amount of time, so we have lots and lots to talk about, but we're going to help to define the science of reading. You probably see and hear a lot about the science of reading, and it's almost like it gets lost in the chatter and it becomes a buzzword. But we want to talk to you about what exactly the science of reading is. And we also want to dispel some of the myths that are surrounding the science of reading. So then that leads us to the theoretical models that underpin reading development. And finally, we're going to weave throughout the session some implications for instruction to ensure that your learners, English learners, become fully literate in English and learn to speak and understand the language. So let's first start by defining the science of reading. And I'm just kind of curious as to where all of you are. So I'm going to bring up this poll question. And I want you to just kind of rate yourself where you are on this journey of scientific-based reading practices. Have you never heard of the science of reading, which is okay? You keep hearing about it, but you really don't know what it means. You've got some familiarity because maybe you've read a few articles and explored this journey on by yourself. Maybe you've had some training in some specific professional development platforms. And maybe you've gone through so much training that you could lead this session on your own without the help of me. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. You should see it pop up in a window. If for some reason you don't see it, go ahead and just type your answer in the chat box. And don't, there's no pressure, no stress in this because polls are completely anonymous. Yeah, maybe you do a couple categories, or maybe you're about halfway through. We get that a lot, Katie. We should put a multiple choice. The key to Zoom is knowing how to do polls. We'll do a little after session, Mackenzie, and let you know. And by the way, somebody asked about documentation of being here. At the end of this session, you'll have the opportunity to complete a feedback form. And once you click submit to that feedback form, a certificate of participation will be emailed to you. All right, so I've got about 85% of participants who have responded. I'm going to give it, maybe about 5 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So yeah, it's kind of what I expected, and this is typically what we see. We have some people on the line that have never heard of the science of reading, and that's okay. We have some people who keep hearing about it, but they really don't know what it means. They just keep hearing these terms over and over and over again. Some have explored deeper and I've read a few articles. I've got some few on the line who have gone through some very specific training. And then I have a few on the line who could join me in doing this training themselves, which is fantastic. And that's the challenge, right, of putting together a presentation like this, because we have people that have varying degrees of knowledge about the science of reading and what it means for our students. So if you do have that very intense knowledge, just kind of bear with us for a little bit. Maybe you'll pick something new up along the way to put into your own presentations. But let's start to really dig into what exactly is this science of reading. Many people define it in many different ways, but we're going to kind of go with the official definition. And that is that the science of reading refers to a body of knowledge. It's not a program. It's not individual practices, okay? What it is, it's an accumulation of knowledge that includes what science has determined to be relevant to reading acquisition, how we assess for reading, how we assess our poor readers, and the interventions that are available once we've determined that a reader is struggling. The science of reading involves precisely what science has discovered to be relevant, and not only relevant to reading, but taking a look at its sub-skills and reading acquisition. And it's how we modify those experiences so that our poor readers can really become competent readers. And it's all about helping us to inform the type of instruction that needs to occur. So when we think about the science of reading, it's not just one thing. It includes phonology, it includes phonics, it includes orthography and fluency and vocabulary and comprehension. There's some neuroprocessing that goes along in relation to scientific-based reading practices. It's all about how we read, how we process, how we remember what we read. It's about our writing systems. It's about the alphabetic principle and letter-sound relationship. And that's just a few of the pieces that encompass the science of reading. But we get all of our information, we gather this body of knowledge from several areas. We gather it from cognitive psychology and the work of Dan Willingham. We gather it from neuroscience and the work of Stanislas Dehaene. We turn to education researchers like Marianne Wolf and Marilyn Adams and Tim Shanahan. And of course, the field of linguistics, which many of you might be familiar with. So this is the science of reading. It is not just one thing. And you can see this is what instruction encompasses when we turn to scientifically based reading practices. We dive into explicitly discussing the phonemes of the English language. We talk about how those phonemes are then attached to the graphemes, the letters, those squiggly lines that are on the page that we call letters. Being fluent not only in speaking, but then attaching that code so that we are fluent in reading. And vocabulary and background knowledge. These are the significant components of the science of reading. So I told you you were going to be interacting quite a bit tonight. So I do have another poll question to bring up for all of you, and it's actually a three-part question. So when we talk about the science of reading, we've been doing this, okay? And so I'm curious as to about how many years you think we've been doing all of this. I also want you to think about how does the brain process text when reading? And when we think about reading comprehension and word level reading, are there simple factors that are involved, true or false? So let me bring up this poll for you. Okay, so it's a three-part question. I'll stop talking so you can process. So I've got about 72% of you have responded. I'll give you about 10 more seconds. Okay, let's see how we did. How many years have we been studying and researching how students learn to read? About 40 years. Yeah, the National Reading Panel came out with its recommendations actually about 20 years ago. We are actually celebrating the 20th anniversary of the National Reading Panel report. So they came out with that report 20 years ago, but then they backtracked even further to accumulate the research that they used to develop the report. So we've been at this for about 40 years now. And so we think we're just now starting to crack the surface and really getting this understanding out there about it is a science of how our brains learn to read. And it's really remarkable how our brains learn to read. And we'll be talking more about that as we go through these next several sessions. How does the brain process text when reading? The brain actually processes text letter by letter. Now, it might seem as if it's processing whole words because we are proficient readers. However, when we think about what's really happening in the left side of our brains, our brain is paying attention to every single grapheme and the sounds that those graphemes represent. And we're going to be diving into that in session 3 when we talk about word recognition. And then the third question, by both reading comprehension and word level reading are similar in that they can be boiled down to a few simple factors. That, in fact, is false. The reading process is a very complex process. There are a lot of processes that have to be going on simultaneously. And through these next several sessions, we'll talk about each of those processes. We kind of talk about them in isolation, but really what's happening, they are all working together so that we can be proficient readers. And the key to all of this, though, is explicit instruction, which you're going to hear a lot in the next couple sessions. So, That's the science of reading, right? So that's what it all kind of boils down to, all of these different factors and all of these different areas. So here's though what you might be hearing about the science of reading. You might be hearing that the science of reading is focused on phonics instruction only. Well, phonics is a piece of the science of reading. However, it's not all about phonics. You also may have heard that explicit and systematic means that every child is subject to the same instruction at the same pace. That's not exactly true. Explicit is a key component. Systematic with routines and expectations are a key component. Having a sequential nature and following a logical scope and sequence. However, we really do look to see where students are and make sure that they are provided the core instruction that is necessary, and then also attending to the individual differences to remediate where necessary. We also a lot of times hear that it doesn't include practices that are associated with enjoying reading. And the thing I want you to think about is, think about if you're not good at something. I always use golf as an example. I stink at golf. My husband loves golf. He wants me to go play golf with him, and I really stink at it. It's hard for me to enjoy playing golf because I'm not good at it. So think about enjoying reading. If you're not a good reader, if you can't read the words on the page or you can't understand the words on the page, you're not going to enjoy reading it. And so when we think about this phonics only approach, we go back to what's called the simple view of reading, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Phonics is a piece of good instruction. It is not all the instruction. Explicit and systematic. Explicit instruction in decoding and phonemic awareness and vocabulary and language structure. That's a hallmark of components of all the successful studies with English learners. We'll refer to some authors, we will refer to some national studies that were done, and all of them refer back to explicit instruction being the key. We don't learn by osmosis. Nobody learns by osmosis. Our brains learn by being explicitly taught the sound symbol relationships and the code of written English. And again, there's nothing more motivating than knowing how to read. We also hear that there are many ways to teach children how to read, and that English learners learn to read differently. In a few slides, we're going to help to dispel this myth, because we're going to talk about what's actually happening in the brain as we are learning how to read. We also hear that it doesn't include practices that are engaging for children. That is also a myth. There, in the Padlet, there is a resource that talks about how you're making a shift from perhaps some programs you are using or are exposed to a more of a balanced literacy approach that really talk about how engaging these practices are for children, because it really involves tapping into sounds, it involves tapping into the graphemes, it involves tapping into multisensory interaction with the sounds and the symbols to make meaning, and then finally context. And then what's interesting is that one of the biggest myths of the science of reading is that we already do this. Well, unfortunately, if we were already doing this, we would see the results in many of our schools. And right now, we're not seeing these practices widespread, and that's kind of why we are where we are. So we really want to delve into what's our brain doing. Okay, and how can we help students to activate and really develop the neurons that are necessary to learn this code and learn this language? And Stanislas Dehaene says it best. He wrote Reading in the Brain. It's kind of a story about all of the processes that are in the brain and what's happening. And he says, it's simply not true that there are hundreds of ways to learn to read. When it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain that imposes the same constraints and the same learning sequence. We are born to speak. We are born for language. We are not born with brains that are hardwired to learn the code of our language. And so it's all about how we build this system of neurons and synapses, and we build this network inside the brain through explicit instruction. So I've been going on and on now for about 30 minutes. And I'm curious, and this is your chance to either type in the chat box or unmute yourselves if you'd like. Of all the myths and misconceptions about the science of reading, are there any that surprised you? And if they did, why? Or maybe you knew all this and they weren't surprising to you. Maybe you've witnessed it firsthand. But let's just take a moment to think and process about these first few slides and what I've just talked about. You can chat, you can type it in the chat, or open up your microphones and feel free to share with 200 of your closest friends.
I think it's interesting that we often think we need to approach learners in such different ways, especially our English learners. But when it comes down to it, we all learn how to read in that same sequential way. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. There are not many ways to teach children how to read because I work with students with disabilities. Yeah. Yeah, so multiple learning styles is interesting because there's actually some, there's also some research that have kind of dispelled the idea of learning styles. If you look at the work of Dan Willingham and if you Google Dan Willingham learning styles, he has lots of articles and presents lots of research about this. The brain processes reading letter by letter. Sight words. Okay, Anna, I'm going to have you hold that thought, at least for another couple sessions, all right? Because I think we probably have a lot more skeptics in the room.
Okay.
Yeah, why do you all not know this?
Carolyn, Katie in here posted that she's not sure 100% about how it's different from balanced reading. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, so balanced reading, there's lots of ways to think about balanced reading. And so the most recent way we think about balanced reading can be attached to whole language, where if you expose children to books and reading and lots of language, that's going to be enough to teach them how to read. Well, we know that those things are important. We are not ditching reading to children. We are not ditching to exposing them to good literature. And we are not, certainly not ditching the fact that we need to talk to them and use all kinds of academic language. But what we do need to think about is the fact that that code, those words that are on the page, have to be explicitly taught. We don't acquire all of that. And that's, we acquire it through being taught what all of those sounds and symbols are making. And so that's where that disconnect between balanced literacy and the simple view of reading comes into play, because it's really not when we look at the simple view of reading in a little bit, it's not going to be a balance. Both components are necessary. Neither on its own is sufficient. However, depending on grade level, we're going to place more emphasis on certain areas of, we call the 5 components of reading. Okay. Yeah. How the research of learning to read is the same in languages other than English. Yeah. Teresa, we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. I found that fascinating too. All right. I was kind of scrolling through as you were typing. Yeah, and so here's the thing, right, Donna? A lot of us don't even remember how we were taught to read. We just seem to, all of a sudden, it just happened, right? Our brains kind of don't go back that far. Maybe though, if you were a struggling reader, you remember the angst and the heartache that you felt not being able to do what everybody else in your class was doing. And so you're right. I don't remember anyone ever teaching me how to read. All of a sudden knew how to do it, right? And that's what that's what's interesting, is that somebody along the line taught me how to do it. Or maybe I was one of the lucky ones that did pick it up. But we've got lots of students that aren't part of that lucky one that knows how to knows how to do it. Okay. All right, so let's talk about this brain. And I want to go back to the learning to read in your L1 is the same as your L2. And there's some truth, but there's also a caveat to that. The truth is that learning to read in your L2 is basically the same as learning to read in L1. And that basically is a key point. The brain is the brain, okay? So if we think about our fist as being the brain, we've got our brain here. This is the left side of my brain. I have my brain's letter box back here in that occipital lobe. That's that visual word form area. I have a processing system here that processes the sounds of speech and helps to then connect to the letters that are on the page. And then I have a processing system here that helps with the meaning and the context. But when we think about the brain and how the brain is structured, that's the brain. And as we teach students to recognize the sounds of the language that they are speaking and then learning to read in, and we teach them the sound symbol relationship of the language that they're learning to speak and read in, that creates further activation. That's the part of the brain that we really want to light up. Now, it's basically the same, and here's the caveat. Our English language learners need to have some additional instruction about the language supports of the language that they're learning. So they require additional supporting brain regions during learning because they don't have an already present system of the phonology of the language and the semantic, the meaning piece of the language. So yes, we are teaching them the language. Okay, we're helping them with the meaning and the vocabulary and the language structures, but we're also helping to connect those sound symbol relationship, because that's important in actually learning the code piece of English. Now, my partner in crime, Michelle Elia, she did a fantastic session at our Literacy Academy a few years back. Actually, I think it was just last year. It's hard to believe that was a year ago in February. But she did a fantastic session at the Literacy Academy about the reading brain. And she taps into all of these processors, and she taps into the fact that the brain is the brain. And this is what we have. And this is the type of instruction that helps to activate it. And some students need more instruction to activate particular parts of the brain. And that is linked in your Padlet. So you don't have to furiously try and write down this YouTube link. That is linked in the Padlet for you to kind of explore that a little bit further. But here's what we know. And if you are familiar with the work of Claude Goldenberg, he's done some really nice webinars over the past few years for us. And so we've really learned a lot through his work and through his research. He found that, and as he studied all of the accumulated research, he tells us that the foundation for learning to read is the same in L1 and L2. And foundation, we really mean that word recognition kind of basis. However, they're not identical. Our English learners really do require some additional language supports, and these additional language supports help to bind orthography to the phonology and the meaning. And I think as I was scrolling through, I thought somebody say, gosh, my kids really have a hard time with nonsense words. I'll bet they do, because there's nothing to bind the phonology and the orthography. Nonsense words are nonsense words, right? They don't mean anything. And so we're teaching them the code, and nonsense words might be difficult, but that's still a way. And really in the use of nonsense words are really used to assess whether or not they've mastered the code. It doesn't tell us anything about the meaning and meaning in the context. That's the purpose of a nonsense word through Acadience or Ames Web or something like that. But yeah, they may struggle with that, but they also need that explicit instruction to help them with that sound symbol relationship. So I talked about this idea of balanced literacy and this truth about teaching our English language learners. Really what it all boils down to is a good foundation in core instruction. And as we talk through this series, we're going to talk about the 5 components of reading. We're going to talk about phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, and then what it means to our English language learners. So we have to teach those 5 components of reading, and we have to provide that additional support in language. Okay. Yeah. So that sometimes they try to make them real words. And that is a key that there's a misunderstanding in the code. Okay, because when you tell them, you need to make sure that you are reading the sound symbol relationship, letter by letter, sound by sound. If they've had if they haven't had as intense instruction in the code, then they're going to find those nonsense words to be particularly difficult, because it is all about learning that code. We're going to talk a little bit more later about this graphic that I have in front of you. This is what we refer to as the changing emphasis of the big ideas of reading. Here's where this idea of this isn't a balanced approach really is solidified. Because if you notice, from kindergarten all the way to 5th grade, we are still teaching the components. However, the purple areas are where the components are emphasized. So we're building this strong foundation in phonemic awareness and phonics in kindergarten through about the middle of 1st grade. We can move into advanced phonics and multisyllabic words, while also then connecting this to text. We'll talk about some decodable text as we get into session 3. However, all through this process, though, we are still teaching vocabulary and comprehension through speaking and listening, through listening, reading, and writing. Okay, and even in our 5th grade classrooms, there are some elements of phonemic awareness. And so we want to think about, what is the core instruction like for your English language learners? And also think about, are they part of core instruction? Because that's the key. They have to be a part of this core instruction, and then we can provide some additional supports in the language features. So I've mentioned some of these theoretical models that are underpinning reading development. So let's dive into those. But first, and I'm noticing a lot of comments and questions coming through in the chat box, and I'm trying to read and talk at the same time, but that is just not a skill that I have mastered very easily. So if anybody has a burning comment or question that they'd like to share, either in the chat box or open up your microphone, we can spend just a few minutes kind of talking about that and addressing that. And I do have a few people on the line that can help me with that too. I know I have Dana's on the line and Kelly Perrin's on the line. We've got lots of people to support this conversation and support you in your language journey.
Carolyn, I just want to start because there's been a few comments about adolescent students and middle school and high school students, and how this might not apply to them. There's a concern of, where do we start with those students? And I know that that's coming in the sessions to come, but if you want to just address that now briefly, knowing you're going into detail later.
Yep. And that was, I knew that question was coming, and that was the one that I was trying to prepare the best that I could for. And here's kind of you may not like this answer. The demands of an adolescent learner are much, much higher than a younger reader. And so with our adolescent readers who are trying to catch up to not only the code and the language, they're really going to need even double and triple the supports. They still have to be in our core classrooms. They have to be able to be participating and listening and hearing and interacting with the language of their content and the demand of their content. And then the supports you provide them, we're going to talk about 2 domains. We're going to talk about word recognition and language comprehension. And so as you are working with your adolescent readers, you have to determine when you're providing those additional support, where are you going to really start that intervention and start that support? Do they need help in the code? And that probably for the most part is going to be, how do we decode multisyllabic words? With our middle school readers and adolescent readers, we can't go back to the, to the baby decodable books and the little, pictures and sound symbol relationship cards. We have to be very, very strategic in helping them to break down a multisyllabic word by teaching them how to recognize syllable types, teaching them to recognize a consonant, vowel, consonant, syllable, and where the vowel in the middle is going to be a short vowel. So we have to start thinking about how we teach those syllable types to help them break down break down those multisyllabic words. I haven't dug into Words Their Way too much. What I am familiar with Words Their Way, they have a really great spelling diagnostic. And that spelling diagnostic that you give can be a nice instructional component to kind of see where they are in the encoding process of English. So they give you a list of words, and there's a basic spelling screener and there's an advanced spelling screener, and it can kind of give you a window into some of the patterns that they know, and that can give you a window then into some intervention diagnostic procedures.
And Carolyn, not to take away from what I know is going to be coming, but I just want to be clear that, when we have older kids come in, talking about the older kids, some of our kids are coming to us with a foundation of literacy skills in their native language,
Yes.
and that will transfer. But what they might need extra assistance with is the specific phonemes that are new. And phonemes are the smallest unit of sound in our words. So they may need introductions to some of those sounds, like the soft TH, that are going to be new to them. And then the spelling that goes with that. What spelling makes that sound, or what spelling make those long vowels that some of our kids struggle with. So even when they come to us at the older level, they may need help with that. But we don't be focused on that. We have to focus holistically on, and not to throw that word out because I don't want to confuse anybody, but we need to be focusing on the content and the language development as well, not just those pieces, but that's a piece that we can focus on. And we could do it at the morphemic level too if we're in a whole class settings. So I just wanted to throw that piece in there. And with the younger kids, we want to make sure that we are developing their oral language. We learn from speech to print, so we have to keep, we can focus on these pieces, but we have to do read alouds, and we have to have discourse with our students as well. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, and that goes back to, that's perfect, Anna, because going back to those 5 components and that changing emphasis, and you see even these areas of vocabulary and comprehension, they need to hear the language and have opportunities to practice the language. And then Dana's right, that's coming about the phonemes, because our English language has lots of phonemes that aren't present in other languages. And the only way for a child or a student to know that is if you draw it out and you show them and you tell them that, so that they can make that connection. And that, you're right, that is coming in session 3 as we practice that. But I've mentioned again this the importance of a multi-tiered system of supports, and really thinking about where our students are educated. Where are they in terms of their core instruction? All students should be participating in core instruction. Okay, core instruction is designed to be preventative. It's for all students. Think about your health. Okay, well, I know this is not a great topic now to talk about flus and diseases and all that, but think about every year you go for your physical, right? And for your physical, a physical is something that ideally every person should have. It's a screening process. We think about what every person needs. They need rest. They need good diet. They need exercise. There's a core set of components that every person needs. Now, for some people, that's not enough. Diet, exercise, sleep isn't enough. So on top of those core principles, we need to add some additional measures to ensure health. Maybe, maybe you're not sleeping well enough. So your doctor might prescribe some melatonin to help you sleep, but you're still going to try to sleep. Okay, but then you might need some additional aids. Maybe with your diet, the way your diet is working, maybe you need some cholesterol medication, maybe you need some high blood pressure medication, but that you're not going to stop eating. to take the blood pressure medication, you're still going to eat right. And then in addition, and then some people need even more intensive supports to keep their body healthy. But we want to think about the fact that everybody is working through these universal core instruction preventative measures. And we want to ensure that our English language learners are in that same boat. Now, I also want you to think about, because we hear this a lot, and we see this pyramid a lot. This pyramid we're not labeling our students. And here's how I like to think about this. We don't have, depending on our universal screeners, we don't have a bunch of green, yellow, and red kids running around our buildings. We have students, we have all students who are receiving core instruction. We have some students who need some additional supports and might be receiving some tier 2 interventions. And then we have some students who are receiving even more support in addition to their tier 2 and their tier 1 services. However, we don't have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kids. We're labeling the supports that we are providing. We're not labeling the individual students. Which brings me to my next poll question. Which of these is not true about multi-tiered system of support and literacy? And yes, Stephen, I just saw your comment, and I'm so glad you asked it.
While you're taking the poll, just so you know, there's been a lot of really good feedback and comments in here. And if we don't address it right now, there will be time at the end of the session today that you can unmute and bring up your points, and we can discuss further, as well as some of the questions and comments are going to be addressed in the future sessions as well. Just so keep that in mind.
Yeah, there's so much we want to tell you that we could only cram so much into a
And Marissa, you have a great question that I know a lot of Ohio educators are really struggling with, and I think we'll save room to talk about that for sure.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of these questions that you're asking, like Marissa's question and comment, a lot of them can't be solved at the teacher level. Some of these really require a coordinated building and district response. We talk a lot with a whole team of people that I work with about systems change and changing our systems. And so some of these questions really are all about how do we create these strong systems that allow for things like solid core and the intensive supports that some of our students need in addition to the core. So you ask a very good question, and some things are bigger than us, right? And it really speaks to a really coordinated district response.
And also this, what I'm doing while I'm reading these chats, it's hard to keep up, but while I'm reading these, I'm kind of taking mental notes and paper pencil notes too for future topics that Ohio TESOL can address further and go into a deeper level with our membership as well. So we'll be taking note of everything and being tracking all the comments.
Yeah, I'm glad you're doing that, because like I said, I've yet to master the talk and read as I'm scrolling through Zoom. All right, so let's go ahead and end the polling, and let's share the results on which of these is not true about multi-tiered system of support and literacy. So the one that is not true is that students can miss components of core instruction. And I know that's hard, and I know many times that is out of your hands. However, I want you to really think about what the work of Claude Goldenberg is telling us, is that foundation matters, that core instruction matters. And then we have those additional supports that we can offer. And it's not just our English language learners. All children should be part of core instruction and should not be pooled for other services during core instruction. And to Marissa's point, that's why it takes a systemic response to developing a building-wide system, which many times is out of your hands. You're charged with educating your students and you're given a set of parameters to do that. But we really want to ensure that our learners, all learners, are not pulled from that core instruction, because it's really about building this tier of support. And so I shared one version of the pyramid. Here's another version of the pyramid. And what I really like about this one is it's stacking these layers on top of each other. Everybody is getting that core. Some are getting some targeted instruction. Some are getting some more intensive instruction. And here's just another way to take a look at it. But you've seen some graphics for the simple view of reading as we've gone through here. And some of you are familiar with this. Others of you may not be, and that's okay. Simple view of reading is our theoretical framework. It is the theoretical framework that we base all of our work in. The simple view of reading really, though, is not so simple. It looks simple, but it's not. Basically, what it tells us is reading comprehension, you can see on the right-hand side, is the product of two domains. It's the product of word recognition and language comprehension. Both domains are necessary. Neither on its own is sufficient. You have to be able to read the words on the page, and you have to be able to understand those words. That's how you achieve reading comprehension. Think about students who can't read any of the words on the page, yet if you would read something to them, they're pretty good, right? However, they're not considered to be a proficient reader because they're missing that word recognition piece. Same holds true. You might have students who have cracked the code, who can read every single word on the page, but they don't know what they're reading. That's not a proficient either. And I know I'm a literacy expert and I'm not much of a math expert. However, I do know that 0.5 times 0.5 doesn't equal 1, it equals 0.25. So even if you have a little bit of something, okay, and a little bit of language comprehension, you still don't have that complete package. You need to have strong word recognition skills and strong language comprehension skills in order to be a proficient reader. So how do we plan for our instruction? Well, we need to think about those general language comprehension skills. We need to think about the fact that the goal of reading is to make meaning. But in order to make meaning, you have to have these language comprehension skills, and you have to be able to accurately identify and fluently the words in the words in the print. And reading comprehension, again, it's the product of language comprehension. And we get this work from Joe Torgerson. And Joe Torgerson did a lot of his research and work with adolescent readers, but then he also has this article where he accumulates some of the research in preventing reading difficulties as well. So when you are planning for your instruction, and here's where we really start to think about, okay, well, what does all this research and what do all these models mean for me? What it means that I have to consider, where are my students in their word recognition skills and where are they in their language comprehension skills, and how do I set their goals so that reading comprehension is attained by all of them. So here's another way to think about the simple view of reading. Remember I said it's not so simple? This really starts to expand it. And we really do thank Dr. Anita Archer for this, because she really helps to deconstruct what each of these domains is. So if we think about language comprehension, it's not about just listening to the language and understanding what somebody is saying. It's about, do you have academic language skills? Do you have background knowledge? Do you have academic vocabulary? Do you have topic-specific background knowledge? Now, maybe you know a little bit about a couple different things, but do you know some things about a lot of different things, and that you can then learn to read more to learn more? Do you have formal communication structure? Yeah, everybody has the way they communicate, and that discourse of, how you speak with your principal and how you speak with the colleague next door versus how you speak to your significant other or your friends or your children. But in order to have language comprehension, are you aware and are you proficient in formal communication structure? The language of school. Everybody has the language that we're loved in, that language of home, and that is critical to who we are as individuals. What the purpose of school is, though, is to ensure that students understand the language of school. It's the language of commerce, it's the language of law. It's the language that the world revolves around in. And Dr. Julie Washington is the perfect example to talk about this. And she's going to be speaking at our Literacy Academy. We have to learn the language of school, right? And that's in addition to that language that we are loved in. We have to understand that discourse. We have to understand that language of school. So language comprehension, there's a lot that goes into it. Vocabulary and language play key roles in this. And when our students have strong vocabulary skills in their L2, that's going to impact how well they're going to comprehend the text in their L2. Okay. Yeah, clean your room. They don't understand. I know that's a lost concept, right? Clean to a teenager doesn't mean the same thing that it does to the parent, right? B, I know, I get it. So we want to think about the vocabulary that we're using both orally and the vocabulary that we are introducing to our students, making sure that we are building enough background knowledge with them so they can combine what they know and what they are learning. We want to make sure that we're integrating multiple opportunities to use new vocabulary, have them use those words, have them use them in sentences, have them speak, engage in a conversation, throw out a word and integrate it into your conversation with them. But it's not enough to just know the definition of a word. You really have to be able to use it and know it and own that word. And it has to be multiple opportunities for engagement. It's that ping pong, it's that back and forth, it's that turn and talk. It's that taking turns of hearing the language and then using the language. So let's think about our decoding skills. And I am going to call upon, if she's ready, my partner in crime to help us deconstruct these word recognition skills. Are you there, Michelle?
I'm here. I logged in under a different name on my other computer. So whenever you get time, make me a co-host,
I will do that.
Awesome. And then there's a question in here from Melissa that she understands not wanting to miss core classes, but taking middle school out of his art classes, they get upset. That is, Melissa, that's a struggle across the board for our students who need interventions. And that's why we always suggest that schools offer an intervention period. So you're not pulling kids out of arts, you're not pulling them out of gym, you're not pulling them out of science and social studies, because teaching art and teaching any content area builds knowledge and really helps our students to focus on things that they enjoy. So we don't want to pull kids out of any content area, any classes, but that if they have an intervention period built into their schedule, then that's going to be the time when you're going to want to.
Yeah, and Michelle, before you came in, we talked about some of these issues are bigger than the people that are in this room, and it takes a really coordinated, systemic, building level, district level response. So we are aware, and we know that idealistically some of these things might not work right now, and that's why we really work with leadership quite a bit so that they understand how important these aspects are.
Yeah, and if you come to any of our principal PD, we talk a lot about the importance of an intervention period built into the day.
Yeah,
because that's a great point, Melissa. Okay, so I'm talking about decoding. I apologize for being late. I was at another training, but I'm glad to be here. So let's talk about the decoding skills on the simple view of reading. So decoding includes what we affectionately refer to as phonics, right? but also includes a building blocks to help phonics, which is phonological awareness. And then as our students are learning the sounds, they're able to map the sounds to the print. That's what brings us then phonics, but then they have to be able to do so with accuracy and automaticity. So that's where we have our fluency. And then fluency also includes our ability to read with rate and expression. That doesn't happen though unless our kids can first decode. And we know that one of the biggest areas under the decoding skills that our English learners struggle with is the phonological awareness. But that is also very variable depending on their reading instruction in their L1. So David Kilpatrick just commented on this actually a couple days ago on Spell Talk, which is one of my favorite listservs for the science of reading. And he was sharing some research that found that English learners who've had great reading instruction in their L1, and most of our Spanish speakers in many countries teach great explicit phonics. So if they've had that explicit phonics in their L1, then phonics will be easier for them in English or their L2. But one of the things that will still elude them is the phonology. And so we really need to be willing to focus on that phonology and provide additional supports in phonology for our English learners, because we know that that is something that it could definitely be an issue in learning to decode in English. And then the other challenge, so that phonological awareness, the other challenge though that is going to be for English is because it is some people say an opaque language. I like to say it's a more complex. It's a deep orthography. So in many languages that have more shallow orthographies, there's that letter sound correspondence that's always the same. Every letter always represents a sound. And the rules are a little simpler, right? But in English, being a more complex and opaque and challenging and deep orthography, we're going to have a lot more rules to learn. And then, yes, Cynthia, what about those students who, I'm sorry, Alyssa, what about those students that didn't have any core instruction in their L1? We, again, need to make sure that we provide those interventions in decoding. So what we need to remember is, going back to what I'm sure Carolyn already mentioned earlier, we know that learning to read in any language uses virtually the same regions of the brain, right? So we know that we have to provide that core instruction in decoding to all students, including my English learners, using systematic explicit phonics instruction, systematic explicit phonemic awareness instruction. But then our students with disabilities and our students who are English learners, so to Cynthia's question with their students with disabilities, they're going to need additional supports in decoding. Many of my English learners, like I said, pick up decoding really quickly because they've had that background, but not all. And it would be wrong of me to say that that happens for all of our English learners, because it doesn't. And phonological awareness will continue to be an issue with that. But remember that decoding is not just phonological awareness. It's not just phonics. It's phonics, it's phonological awareness, it's that fluency, that accuracy, rate, prosody, and it's also sight word recognition, the ability to decode words instantly and effortlessly, which does not come from memorization of words, but it instead comes from mapping the letters, the orthography, to the phonology or the sounds, which in English.
That was the mind blown question, Michelle, when we had the poll.
Oh, the letter by letter?
We've already been there, and that was the mind blown question. They're all ready for that one. They want to know why that is.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? I think for so long we tried to teach words as whole words, and that we kind of realized we were messing up their brains and not doing what the brain was good at doing. And we shared with you the video that I did for the Literacy Academy on how the brain reads. I highly recommend you follow up this training with that one. Let's learn about the brain so we can teach to it. Right? Stanislaw Dehaene says you have to understand the brain so you can teach to the brain. And then, yeah, to Carolyn's point, you need to know this simple view of reading so you can intervene appropriately. You need to be able to recognize, is it a decoding problem? Is it a language comprehension problem? Or is it, for many of our kids, both? In which case, I'm going to need to be able to intervene in both of those. And hopefully we're stretching your thinking a little bit, because that's our goal.
Yeah, I think so. And if we don't get to your point, we are going to be saving this chat, and Dana and Michelle and we are going to debrief afterwards. And maybe we'll create some little mini sessions for you on specific topics that really kind of are piquing your interest, because like we said, this is an hour and a half to 2 hour session. We have 3 more to go, but what we're going to talk about is much bigger. It's much larger than that. We're not going to solve all of the reading problems in these 4 sessions, but you are asking fantastic questions and making great comments. The Reading Brain video, I just put the link to the Padlet, and it's in the Padlet. So I'll keep linking that stuff.
And yeah, it's linked in the handouts. It's linked on the Padlet. You've got it in multiple places. So Carolyn is beautiful with Padlets. So her Padlets are always great, and you'll be able to access everything you need with those. And then when it comes to sight words, thank you, Deanna. I love that, the definition of sight words, because it's really important. This is not a word that we're memorizing by as a whole unit. Any sight word is a sight word. Every word on this screen for all of you is a sight word, because you didn't have to think about it. You were able to read it effortlessly and automatically. And my friend, Dr. Carol Tolman, says, as if by sight. As if by sight. But these, believe it or not, phonology plays a much bigger role in this process than vision. Phonology is critical to the process of sight word recognition. It's not a visual task, so sight word's kind of a misnomer. It's a phonological task, and that's why we need to, every word is a sight word. And that's why we need to pay attention to the phonology. We don't store words as sight words unless we map them to the phonology. So we need to make sure that we're helping our kids code switch so that they understand the pronunciation in standard English. That's going to really help them to store that word for automatic retrieval. But we also know we have to help our kids get to the phoneme level, because that is what differentiates good readers from struggling readers. The ability to come down to the phoneme level. So if phonemic awareness is not part of your core instruction, then we have a huge problem. But then for many of our readers, for our English learners, it needs to also be part of our intervention. Phonology matters. The ability to blend and segment individual phonemes is a strong predictor of overall reading achievement in any language, but also for our children who are speaking 2 languages.
Yeah, so Cynthia, you bring up a great point, and you guys are thinkers tonight. I'm telling you, for 5 o'clock in the evening, whew, you are on it.
We need to do a sight word presentation for these folks.
I know. That's going to be a follow up to the word recognition. Yeah, so we teach some words as if they are called as if by heart, and we have to keep certain parts of that word. Now, also consider that there are about 4% of the words in the English language that follow no particular pattern. However, most of the words follow some kind of pattern, or we revert back to the morphology and the etymology, because we are a morphophonemic language. And so we derive our language from lots of different places. And so there is a process, it's called the heart word process, where again, like Michelle says, phonology matters. And we don't necessarily teach them by memorization. We teach the students to recognize the part that is irregular, and that's the part of the word that they know by heart. But the rest of the word can be decoded and encoded through phonology and orthography. That's a whole other section, but you're right. There are some words, and we call those words heart words, but we still teach them with the premise that phonology matters through those sound symbol relationships. We'll weave a little bit of it into the word recognition strand, but we may need to do a separate session on that too.
Yes, and I touch on that in the Reading Brain presentation. So if you watch that, you'll get it. And then just to speak to teaching sight words in context. Context is not a means of storing those words for automatic effortless retrieval. We store those words based on their orthography, mapping it to the phonology, and then after we do that, we connect it to meaning. So we want to be able to teach the way the brain reads. So I highly recommend you absolutely watch the Reading Brain video, because it's really about the phonology and the orthography, anchoring those together. That's going to ensure it gets stored in the brain's letterbox for automatic effortless retrieval. And in our brain, it starts with the orthography, goes to the phonology, and then we connect it to meaning. And that's why that oral language piece is so important. We learn to read from speech to print. And so that's why the oral language connection and language in general is going to be the key for English learners, but for all readers to learn to read.
Okay, so we talked about, I know, take a breath, take a drink of water, Michelle. You worked hard tonight. So the simple view of reading is that one theoretical model. And we love the simple view of reading because it's simple, right? However, the simple view of reading sometimes is misinterpreted because it is not simple. So what Hollis Scarborough did was, after Goff and Tunmer developed the simple view of reading through the accumulation of research that they gathered, Hollis Scarborough took that simple view of reading and she said, you know what, I need to make something that parents can understand where their children are in their reading ability and where they need to go to build the skills that are necessary to be a skilled reader. So she developed the reading rope. And what she does is she takes the simple view of reading and she really parses out. Remember that poll question that said that reading comprehension and word recognition are just a few simple concepts? Well, they're not. These are really the domains that go into word recognition and language comprehension. So when we think about word recognition, in order to make all words sight words, we have to be able to process words through their sounds and then those little squiggly lines on the page to connect the sounds to those graphemes, those symbols. And when we go through that decoding process, that's how we begin to store words as if by sight. I'm reading these words on the page. All of these words are sight words. But my brain, I was taught at some point how to decode all of those words. And I decoded those words enough times that they are now stored they're stored forever, right? I don't have to struggle to pull the words off the page. And so the simple view of reading and the reading rope can work simultaneously together. This is a great graphic. A lot of teachers use the reading rope graphic. They put it in a plastic sheet protector. They use it during conferences, and they explain to parents, okay, here are some skills that your child is fantastic at. He has great vocabulary, lots of language comprehension. He's been places, you can tell that people talk to him all the time. His language comprehension is sound. However, we are really working on now building up his word recognition skills. We're teaching him that every word that he says is made up of individual phonemes, and those phonemes are represented by the graphemes, by the letters that are on the page. And so by really putting into that language, it helps parents, and that's who Hollis Scarborough developed the rope for, was for parents, so that parents could understand all the components that were necessary for skilled reading. Because really, when you think about it, when we talk about comprehension, that's what we're striving for. Comprehension isn't a series of things that we do. It's an accumulation of a student being able to read those words on the page because we've taught the code, and they have to be able to understand the words through the vocabulary and have all that adequate background knowledge, because when they can do that, they can start to focus on the critical content. And yes, we will be teaching all about orthographic mapping in session 3. So stay tuned, stay with us. But that's comprehension, right? Comprehension isn't, oh, they can't comprehend. Comprehension is digging and going backwards and taking some diagnostic steps to determine why can't they comprehend? Is it a word recognition issue? Is it a language comprehension issue? Perhaps it's a combination of both. All right, we talk a lot, and we are very, very sorry that we talk a lot, which we have been very intentional about letting you kind of process everything that we have been saying. So
I love Ben's question.
Yeah.
So recommend resources for explicit and systematic instruction of language comp. And there are certain components of language comp that have to be systematic and explicit. So Carolyn, can you back up for one slide for one second? Because we are going to talk about this in that session too, right? One more slide back to Scarborough's road. So when it comes to vocabulary, that needs to be explicit and systematic. When it comes to the language structures, teaching syntax, that's going to be very, very explicit. Now, other things like verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge, there's some explicitness in that, but that's where we're going to be working with a lot of texts to build background knowledge. And we're going to be helping our students to get into those texts and dissect them and build their knowledge on a specific topic, unit, or theme, while also teaching the difference between this type of text versus this type of text. So there is some explicitness in there, but language comprehension is it's definitely a more nebulous topic. It's these unconstrained skills, and some of them can be more explicitly taught than others. What I would highly recommend if you want to learn more about language comprehension is I really love this book, The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler. And I also am a big fan of the Reading Comprehension Blueprint by Nancy Hennessy, which I had, oh, here it is. The Reading Comprehension Blueprint. There you go. Look at Vanna for the win. Also a great book, but The Knowledge Gap is a game changer in that. So yeah, great question. Thanks.
And both Natalie Wexler of The Knowledge Gap and Nancy Hennessy of Reading Comprehension Blueprint. I'm going back to college. They have both been speakers at our Literacy Academy. So Natalie Wexler has been face-to-face with people last year in Ohio, and then Nancy Hennessy has been doing some virtual sessions for us. So if you go to the Literacy Academy website, you can see both of their presentations.
We could probably put those on the Padlet.
I linked the Literacy Academy on the Padlet.
I know, Ohio, we are awesome. Seriously.
We are doing good work here in Ohio. We are very proud of where we started and where we currently are. So yes, Ben, thank you. So other comments, questions, things you're trying to process through? And yes, you are correct. And so our second session is going to focus on that language comprehension, which background knowledge, vocabulary is a big factor. And then session 3, we'll dive into that word recognition strand, which is also critical. Both are necessary, neither on its own is sufficient.
Nancy Hennessy, Hennessy.
Yes.
I'll put it in the chat. Okay, any questions before we move on? Otherwise, we're moving on.
I think we're moving on. So what does this mean, right? So when we think about our English learners, it doesn't really matter how we view them, whether they've had previous well, it does matter. But when we're thinking about this umbrella, and we kind of categorize our English learners according to their previous literacy experiences, perhaps their age, whether they had literacy levels in their L1, whether they have oral language versus word recognition, whether they have similarities or differences between the L1, the L2, especially with the phonemes. Whether we are thinking about all of these things or not, we want to teach through a more linguistic lens. And that's really the key to all of this. The key to all of this is language. Language matters. And teachers who are teaching reading and writing to all students need to understand that it's all about language. And there are layers to our language. And Nancy Hennessy, in the very first Literacy Academy presentation, deconstructs all the layers of language that really have to be taught in order to comprehend. That's what comprehension is. It's about, the words on the page. You can start to read all these words, but you have to have the language. Even when we talk about phonology and we talk about phonemic awareness, you have to have language as the sticky, as the Velcro. It's hard to manipulate the sounds of words that you don't know the meanings of and you've never heard before. And so we want to anchor everything that we do in language. And here's what we know. We want to make sure that there is substantial coverage in those key components of reading. We touched upon them briefly. Normally we bring up a poll question, and I'm not sure why we did that, but we really want to make sure that we're teaching those 5 components. We're teaching phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and text comprehension. Because by teaching all of them, that's going to have clear benefits for English language. Now, many people are familiar with the National Reading Panel's report. Even fewer people, though, are familiar with the Developing Literacy in Second Language Learners. This is the report of the National Literacy Panel on Language and Minority Children and Youth. They said the same exact thing, that all learners need explicit instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and text comprehension. But they also went on to say that the research also suggests that there needs to be some adjustments to the amount of instruction that's provided to our English language learners. Because in order to have maximum benefit of those 5 components, we have to sometimes give some extra attention and extra support to the language piece of it. So here's where core instruction comes in. If all students have explicit instruction from the onset in those 5 components, noticing that we emphasize certain components at certain grade levels. In kindergarten and first grade, the foundation really is on phonemic awareness and phonics. However, we are still teaching and reading through read alouds and through themes and text sets to help build that vocabulary and that comprehension, because they have to have the speaking and listening. That's all happening through that core instruction. And so that explicit instruction really does matter. We also then want to take that core instruction. Remember the tiers of instruction. This is all about the type of instruction and the levels of support, not the labeling of students. So we want to take that core instruction and through some really rich screening and diagnostic procedures, really tune into what kinds of additional language supports are going to need to be offered. Okay, and so we want to think about providing native language support when giving oral directions, making connections across the language to really help build that vocabulary and further enhance their background knowledge, repetition, rehearsal, lots of cumulative review, and lots of practice. All of those are good for all children, but especially for our English learners. And then we want to teach the layers of language. We want to teach it through oral language, the discussion, and we want to teach it through written expression. So we keep talking about these layers of language, right? We keep talking about language and we keep talking about language systems. But here's what language systems are. Language systems are all about the phonology of a word. And every language in the world is based on a structure. It's important for us to understand the components of our English language. And so phonology is the ability to process the sounds and produce the sounds in a language. So say the word ameliorate. Just say that. No. I know, that's been popping up a lot, hasn't it? Say ameliorate. All right, how many syllables are in the word ameliorate? Ameliorate. There are 4. What's the first sound? It's What's the vowel sound in the last syllable? It's A. What's that word? Ameliorate. So then we move into the semantic piece of it. How are these words related in context? It's the meaning. This is the ability to understand what words mean. And we have to make sure that students have multiple opportunities to use the words. Not enough to just say it and use it and know the definition. It's then that we can be assured that they have mastery over that word. Gone are really the days of looking up words in a dictionary. The dictionary is like this big vortex where it just leads you to one definition of the other, and you come out of it more confused than you ever did going in. But ameliorate means to make something that is bad, means to make it better. So then we can think about the morphology of it. It comes from a Latin root. We can think about the stem, ate, that can be a verb form. But those are layers of language. We can talk about syntax, how those words are used in a sentence and the rules that govern them. We wanted to ameliorate the risks of an accident happening at the intersection. And then we talk about pragmatics. When do you use this word? Do you use it in normal conversation? Well, I mean, if you're Michelle and I, and this is what you do for a living, then maybe. But in a normal conversation, when you're sitting at happy hour with your friends, you're probably not going to use the word ameliorate. So it's all about when in those formal and informal settings that you use words. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to help make that language and literacy connection here between the language systems and what it means then for literacy.
Brought up happy hour. I don't know, girl. That's been a while.
I know. It's been a while since we've hit up happy hour, huh? We do a lot of Zoom, lot of Zooming for that one.
And there's been a lot of questions coming through in the chat. And so I've been trying to address as many as I possibly can. And a lot of them are about word recognition. And we want you to understand, remember, the science of reading is not just phonics, but we know the word recognition skills are the foundation. And so we really have to build that strong foundation. And if our students don't have it, then we have to go back and intervene. But it is about both sides of the simple view of reading. To Carolyn's point, you can't have one without the other. One thing I always say is anything times 0 is 0. And if we rule out one side of the simple view of reading, oh, well, ELs don't need to worry about word rec. They need to focus on language comp. We can't rule out one side. You need both always. We are always teaching both sides of the simple view of reading. The emphasis changes though. As our kids get older, we spend less time on word recognition. We're still teaching it, but we spend less time. As our kids master word recognition, we spend less time. So just some things to keep in mind. David Kilpatrick's Equipped for Reading Success is an amazing tool for any child, any learner. Remember, when it comes to that word recognition, when it comes to learning to read, same brain regions. The difference is English learners don't know all the sounds in English phonology. So a tool like this is going to be very helpful for them. So that is absolutely going to be helpful for supporting these students, especially in phonological awareness. You can't decode the English code unless you know the sounds of the English code. And that's how we store words. So yeah, super helpful. Love that. Okay, so let's talk about connecting these layers of language because we keep, this is critical. This language component is going to be really critical for learning to read. We learn to read from speech to print. We need to understand all the layers of our language. So phonology, when we're teaching phonology, we do that when we teach phonological awareness. Someone mentioned that Bridge the Gap or Kilpatrick's 1-minute drills. That's when we're teaching phonology. But we also teach phonology when we teach letter sound correspondences. So I don't teach spelling without teaching phonology. I don't teach students to memorize the spelling of words. Even when I'm working with 8th graders and they have to spell a word, my first question is, what are the sounds in that word? Maybe I'll ask them to take it to the syllable level. Maybe I'll ask them to take it to the morpheme level, but maybe sometimes I ask them to go to the individual phoneme level. You don't spell unless you know the phonology. So phonology is going to be part of our instruction when we teach spelling, when we teach phonological or phonemic awareness. Okay, semantics and morphology. We tend to teach these two together, but we don't have to because I teach morphology when I teach spelling as well. That's a word rec skill and a language comp skill. Morphology is the new fun term in literacy because it covers both sides of the simple view of reading. When we teach morphology, we're teaching both word recognition and language comprehension. Plus morphology is great because that's how we tie in the cognates, man. So that's going to be helpful too for my English learners. Semantics, we teach that when we're teaching listening comprehension, when we are teaching decoding. I don't teach decoding unless I tell my kids the meaning of some of those words. Because we know that they need that to help it to stick. Remember, we store words, phonology, connect it to orthography, then connect it to meaning. And semantics are going to be part of our reading comprehension. Reading comprehension breaks down if you don't know the meaning of the words. When a mere 2 to 5% of the words in a passage, we don't know what they mean, reading comprehension falls apart. So semantics is important for comprehension, super important. So student-friendly definitions, oh my goodness, that is so important. It's not to say a dictionary isn't important, but I will tell you, I haven't taught a vocabulary word unless I've gone to at least 3 different sources to learn about the language of origin, the morphemes in the word, and the meaning from the word from multiple sources. So I can come up with a very student-friendly way of teaching it to kids. So when I teach ameliorate, I'm going to teach in a very student-friendly way so they can understand it. But then I'm also going to make sure I cover syntax, because now full disclosure, I'm not bilingual. I'm not cool like many of you. I'm definitely not as cool as Dana Weber, but I know that there's syntactic differences between English and other languages. And so we need to make sure that we focus on those syntactic differences for our kids. And comprehension will break down for students when they decode the sentence, but the syntax doesn't make sense. The word order doesn't make sense. So we have to explicitly, going back to that question about, do we explicitly teach language comp? Well, I explicitly teach the syntax, the grammar of English, but I do so in a way that's not separate. We know grammar doesn't stick when we teach it separately. We do it when we are connecting to text. So I teach my syntax connected to the text and connected to the knowledge I'm trying to help my kids get from the text.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just like phonology matters, grammar matters. And I don't mean like old school Catholic grammar where you're diagramming sentences and, putting all those words on underneath lines and diagonals. I know it's connected. It's connected to the content, because the order that governs words makes a difference, and it makes a difference in connection to the meaning. So again, we're kind of going back to that all students, but the specifically drawing out that grammar connection for syntax is extremely critical for that understanding piece of the text.
Absolutely. And Sheila just asked a question about where do I find out the morphology of word? Okay, so my favorite resource is etymonline.com. I'm gonna put it in the chat box here for you. ETYM online.com. But I did just buy this book. It's called Word Origins. I know, Carolyn, do not go on Amazon. Do not start buying another book. I cannot support your habit any more than I already have, and you support mine in a bad way too. So we've got to stop buying books on Amazon, but etymonline.com is super awesome. It really does give me the morphemes, but then this book is a nice backup as well. It's called Word Origins, and it's in alphabetical order and gives lots of morphology and etymology. Great resource. So make sure that we are teaching. Let's go. We did phonology, we did semantics, we did morphology, syntax, which is that word order and the grammar, but make sure we connect it to knowledge and content and text. We don't teach it in isolation. If we're just writing sentences and practicing grammar in isolation, it doesn't stick. Connect it to knowledge. Connect it to something you want your kids to learn. So if we're learning about photosynthesis, then we're going to teach compound sentences connected to that topic that we're learning about in science and social studies. Connected to the text that we're reading. Okay, last but not least, pragmatics. And that is going to be then that what are the rules that are in written language versus in conversational language, and how are they different? So really specifying to our kids the difference between spoken language versus written language. And sometimes that's going to bring up, we say some really interesting things in English that are not literal, that have some funky translations. And so we need to kind of, make sure that we teach that as well to our kids. Oh, see, Carolyn, you're encouraging this habit of going on Amazon and spending our hard-earned money on more books.
I'm an enabler.
I'm
sorry.
I know another teacher mentioned it in a training I was doing. And of course, I went online and I bought it because I was like, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, do not tell your principals that we told you to go out and buy all of these books. Okay, so those layers of language, and this might be a review, it might be something that you've heard before, but let's kind of put this into context, all right? Let's just kind of do a little brief overview on a couple examples, all right? So when we think about those layers—
Let me tell you how to respond first. You're gonna unmute your mics to respond, and to do that, press and hold the space bar because we want to hear your voice. So your responses are going to be phonology, semantics, morphology, syntax, or pragmatics. So unmute when she's ready.
So okay. On the count of three, I'm going to read the statement, and on the count of three, unmute and say the correct answer. In the word ameliorate, there is the Latin word part melior, which means better. Which layer of language is that? 1, 2, 3.
Morphology.
Morphology.
You got it. See, you guys are advanced learners, I'm telling you.
Morphology.
All right. Ameliorate means to lessen or decrease something that is bad. So if we ameliorate the impact of climate change, we will make our environment better. 1, 2, 3.
Semantics.
Semantics.
Semantics, nice.
Semantics, nice job. All right, so then the last one, when you combine two sentences, use a conjunction. The new sentence will be, the irrigation system will ameliorate the impact of climate change because it will make our environment better.
Syntax.
Is syntax. Yep, it's that order. You got it. It's that order. It's that rule governing structure.
Carolyn, you and I both must have been typing in sentences with conjunctions at the same time.
Oh, and it didn't.
And there were two sentences there. It was like weird. So anyways, we must have both been typing at the same time.
We need to fix that. When our brains converge, it's a scary thing.
Oh,
all right. Okay, so what's this all mean? You're all saying to yourself, okay, well, they've talked about research and they've talked about all these terms, but what do I do? How does all of this transfer? And that's usually the problem, right? The research sits out here and we all sit out here, and there's this great chasm in the middle that's very difficult to bridge. And so what's nice though, is there are sources out there that have helped to bridge that gap between the research and the practice. One of those is through the IES practice guides. There is one for elementary, and there is also one for adolescent English learners. And so the one on elementary pretty much summarizes what we've just been talking about this evening, making sure that in your instruction, and even in their core instruction, that you're emphasizing meanings of everyday words. Quite honestly, there are probably lots of words that native English speakers don't know. So it's not going to hurt anybody to provide meanings of everyday words. We can't assume that everything is a tier one word. Okay, so we make no assumptions as far as language goes. We want to make sure that our English learners understand tasks. Okay, we want to make sure that when a task is given, they know what to do with it. Maybe we need to break it down into smaller chunks. Maybe too many tasks have been given at once and the processing systems are in overload. So we need to break things down into chunks and scaffold the tasks that we're giving them. Maybe we need to repeat, and maybe we need to rephrase in the L1 to ensure the understanding and make that connection to the L2. Again, we've talked a lot, which will be in session 3, about the sounds of English. Our phonemes in English, sometimes we have more phonemes that are found in L1. And so those phonemes have to be explicitly taught because there's sounds they just aren't familiar with, even in that speech aspect of the language. Group English language learners with peers at different English proficiency levels. So if you're doing some small group work, make sure there's lots of interaction and conversation going on. Provide intensive English language development instruction. So there's where that tiers of instruction comes in. We've got that core instruction, but now we need to think about what kind of instruction is being provided at various tiers. And then for many students, they need additional instruction with academic English. And again, honestly, all students benefit from that. That's not an issue that is unique to our English learners. All students can benefit from some additional instruction and some additional language, just simply by using more academic language in the classroom. That gives them a leg up on this.
Here, I have a fun fact, Carolyn, back to that previous slide. So
Yeah.
A fun fact, so when we are familiarizing all of our children with the sounds of English, so every child is born with the ability to make and understand every phoneme in every language in the entire world. Like every child is born with the ability to understand and produce every sound in every language. But what happens is if they're not exposed to a sound, by 6 months of age, they stop responding to it. It's so fascinating. and they will lose the ability to then make that sound. So I always like to say, at one point in my life, I had the ability to roll my R's. I did. I was born with it, damn it, but I lost it.
Oh, and we are all worse off because Michelle cannot roll her R.
Carolyn knows I do lament this all the time because I cannot roll my R's to save my life, and yet my children can, and it really bothers me, but whatever. But it is pretty fascinating that we all were born with this ability, and there's actually been studies that have been done that are just so interesting, where, you know, children were exposed just to read alouds for 1 hour a day, beyond that first 6 months in a different language. And they retained the ability to learn that language easier because they heard that language, so that they didn't lose that 6-month drop off, you know, where we weren't exposed to it. So I just think it's really fascinating that these sounds, we need to continue to expose them, because unfortunately, if they've not heard them, they don't have them anymore. They lost them after that 6 to 8 months.
Oh, Anna, this session is being recorded, so we're not going to put ourselves through that. We will practice that when we are off camera. Thank you for that suggestion.
Water.
All right, moving into, you know, we've got lots of you on the line with our adolescent, our adolescent readers. You know, even Claude Goldenberg tells us that there are increasing cognitive demands on our adolescent readers. But we also want to make sure that throughout this process, we want to build their knowledge through complex text. I know somebody asked the question about putting their students in complex text that they don't understand and with no supports. So you have to have the complex text, but you also have to provide the supports through scaffolding, and you have to build them up to reading and understanding those complex texts. And we'll talk about in the next session through the use of text sets, because as you build their background knowledge and you build that vocabulary, that makes the demand of the complex text minimized or reduced. But again, it all goes back to explicit instruction in the writing processes, explicit instruction in the vocabulary. I'm going to say a word, you're going to say the word, I'm going to give you the definition, let's repeat the definition, I'm going to give you examples, turn and tell your partner something you know about this word, turn and tell your other partner something you know about this word, turn and tell your partner a sentence. We're providing lots of examples and ways for students to use the language, okay? And then remember, it's our interventions, okay? Core instruction may not be enough. However, core instruction, that's how we build that content, that's how we build that knowledge. And then we have our interventions in addition to the core instruction, which are focused on those language structures.
And I shared in the chat a link to a PD recording on scaffolding complex text, but we don't want to not expose our kids, but we do have to provide that additional instruction. So
yeah, and Anna, read alouds are perfect for all grade levels. Absolutely. So going back to our adolescent readers, there's nothing wrong with reading aloud in class. Okay, they have to learn how to hear that language and interact with that language. There's no, and older kids love being read to. They may tell you that they don't. They may give you the eye roll and the, you know, of the tongue and whatever, but they really do like to be read to. They like to hear the language. They like to hear those complex sentence structures that they may not yet be ready to read. Okay, you want to take us to the end, Michelle? We've got a few more little nuggets.
So as we're building knowledge, as we're building that, and we're using that explicit instruction in syntax, one of the best resources we could use to strengthen the brain of all readers, but especially my English learners, is grade level rich text in text sets. So we're going to read multiple texts on a topic at varying degrees of difficulty and challenge. But when we do this, we're actually going to increase their vocabulary, because they're not just hearing a vocabulary word from one text, they're hearing it in multiple texts that are all on the same topic. We're going to increase their background knowledge. When we increase background knowledge, even the most complex text becomes easier for our students. But we're also going to increase their knowledge, their knowledge of the language structures, because we're going to use what Tim Shanahan calls a stair-step text. So we're going to start with slightly simpler text on a topic. Maybe we'll look at an infographic. We'll watch a video on the topic. Then we'll read a short article. Then we're going to move up to something a little bit more challenging. So text sets around one topic really strengthen our brain. And this really kind of aligns with what we know from research for ELs, is that ELs respond best to text that includes familiar content. Well, it's not familiar content unless we built up some background knowledge on it. So that's why we read multiple texts on the same topic. So even if I'm going to read a novel in 8th grade, so if I'm going to read Langston Hughes and, in high school, I'm going to then read other informational texts about maybe the Roaring 20s and what was happening in our country at that time. I'm going to build that background knowledge so they have familiar content to connect to. And so they also understand text when they have opportunities to preview, review, paraphrase, and summarize, which is why we want to make sure that we have before, during, and after reading strategies. We don't just hand kids text and say, have at it. We want to make sure that we scaffold before, we provide that introduction, that vocabulary. We do different things during, including pausing and talking about the complex language in the text. And then we also do activities after. So we're going to go more into that. Don't worry, it's coming. This is the overview. And we can't forget about the neglected standard. Nani Lasso especially calls the speaking and listening standard. She says speaking is the neglected standard, but this has been echoed by multiple researchers. Despite national calls for instructional frameworks that focus on reading, writing, listening, and speaking, or we often say reading, writing, and discussion, one of the most powerful tools is speaking, and it's neglected in many of our classrooms. I always tell folks, the one who does the talking is the one who does the learning. But in most classrooms, who's doing all the talking? We are. So we want our kids to be talking. And that's not unique to a whole language or balanced literacy framework. That's for all, that's an evidence-based practice, right? We want our kids to talk. We want all of our kids to talk. And so when we are incorporating our speaking standards, then we know that's going to benefit ELs, but it's going to benefit all kids.
And I put in the chat box a link to a talk that Nani Lasso did at Harvard University that really explains some studies that she did on the power of talk and the power of teacher talk in a 6th grade classroom, actually across to 6th grade. And it was fascinating that when the amount of teacher talk and interaction with students increased, so did their achievement. It's fantastic.
And if students are only speaking 2% of the time, it's no wonder they don't understand what's happening, right?
Yeah.
Even before writing, we shouldn't be teaching writing unless our students are doing oral rehearsal first. Writing isn't just put pen to paper. Writing is a process that begins with oral rehearsal. And so we want to make sure that we have that first. So there's the speaking and listening, and then we move into writing.
Yeah, so if you're going to take away anything from this session, think about how you're going to incorporate that speech to print element in your instruction, whether it's the decoding of the words to writing to vocabulary instruction, even as you feed content knowledge, say a piece of content in a sentence, have a student repeat the piece of content, play a telephone game, have them tell that piece of content to their neighbor. When it comes back to you, then talk about that little piece. But everything that we do needs to revolve around that element of speech to print. But think about too, where all of this fits. Okay, remember that this is the overview, and you've asked great questions. We know you want to know more. You've got all kinds of little ins and outs that you want to find out about. But as you're moving into next week's session, I want you to think about a couple things. Think about if during your instruction, do you teach the big 5? Are there elements of phonemic awareness? Do you draw attention to the individual sounds that are in words? Do you teach about the graphemes that represent the sounds in the words? And through that, that's how we get decoding. That's that sound symbol relationship. That's where phonics lives. And then that can help with fluency and then eventually comprehension. When we're making the content and the instructions, are we doing it so that it's comprehensible for our students? And if we are strategic in our L1, that's okay. Whatever's going to help our students to make that connection and make the instructions easier to understand. And then also providing those language development instruction and opportunities that directly support reading instruction. So it's about the core, but then what kinds of direct support and targeted support can we provide in those tiers of instruction and intervention? And then also consider, what do my students need? What do they need? What is necessary support for them? Maybe I'm giving them some supports that they don't need. Maybe I'm not giving them enough support in a particular area. And then what's sufficient enough to help them be those independent learners that are going to go out and be really functioning in their core classrooms. So think about the kinds of supports that you can provide and that you are currently providing that really help that instruction. Okay, so we're at Carolyn and Michelle stop, and you all can comment, ask a few quick questions, and then we'll put up the final feedback for you to give us, which will then lead into, you'll get a certificate at the end. They need what the core teacher cannot or does not provide. So now it goes back to core instruction, right? We didn't put in here at the beginning where, what your roles are, whether you are a core instruction, whether you are providing some interventions, whether you are providing some co-teaching services with your teachers. But yeah, core instruction matters. And we try and get that message across, and that what we do for our English language learners also matters for a lot of, for all of our students, because it really is all about language. And, English learners come in with some, with some weakness, not weaknesses, but some areas of refinement in their language. But we've got lots of native English speakers who that language benefits them also.
Don't worry, we'll post the recording. It'll be on the SMORE. It'll also be on the Padlet, so you'll be able to access that without any issue. You guys will have access to it. And we're going to dig deeper into these topics, we promise. But I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times. You can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem, which is why the science of reading is so important for all teachers to learn, not just teachers of English learners. All teachers need to know the science of reading so that we can be sure that core instruction is solid, and then we can provide that additional language support that our English learners need.
Okay, so here is a link to the survey. You can go about this in a couple different ways. One, you can take your camera, hold it up to that QR code, and it should pop right up, and you can take it that way. You can type that link into your browser, or if you want to give me just a second, I will put it into the chat box for you.
You put the link to the evaluation. I'll put the link to the Padlet because some folks were asking for the Padlet too. And I'll put that.
Okay, so this link that has session 1 TESOL will take you to the feedback survey. And when you complete the feedback survey, it will, cross your fingers, send you a certificate that you can use for whatever hours your district gives. And then again, Michelle and I, our contact information is on the screen. You can follow us on Twitter. We only post reading stuff on our Twitter, no political endorsements, categories, anything like that. It's all reading. And we will hang around for a little bit if you have questions and want to unmute, say hello. I hate not being in a room with all of you. It's hard to present when we can't see everybody at one time.
And on behalf of Ohio TESOL, I just wanted to thank both of you for your willingness and eagerness to do this with us and partner with us on this. And there's, as Carolyn said earlier, we're going to be reviewing the chats and some of the questions, and because I know that we couldn't get through everything today and there were a lot of really good questions. So we'll be reviewing that to make sure that some of those ideas and topics are covered in upcoming sessions. And I think somebody unmuted with a comment.
Cynthia, looks like.
Oh, I did. I'm sorry. I didn't even realize I had unmuted. I'm sorry. I am fascinated by all of this because I'm a special ed teacher, but I have a master's in reading because that's my passion. And I am incredibly interested in how all of this can help kids who have dyslexia and other reading disabilities, or can this do away with those types of disabilities, I guess, is my question.
Yeah.
Are we,
so, I
are we
think
going to address that, or?
Yeah, so I think Anita Archer really says it best, is that the magic is in the instruction. And it's the kind of instruction that we provide. A few years ago across the state, we started a state systemic improvement pilot where we had 16 districts across the state engage in professional development for teachers, and then also really look at how we use that professional development to change our instruction. We changed our instruction, the materials that we're using, and really the ultimate goal of that project was to hit core instruction and to teach reading through a preventative lens rather than immediately jumping to an intervention focus. And the goal was really to see, can we catch students before they fail? And perhaps even catch students before they get into the special ed sort of, special ed vortex. Do we have students perhaps in who are identified with learning disabilities that maybe it's not a learning disability, maybe it's more dyslexia. They were never really taught the components of a successful reader, and their brains didn't develop all those neurons and synapses and developed regions of the brain that are necessary for proficient reading. So you pose a really good question. So when we talk about our English language our English learners and the type of instruction that they need, we also think about how we include all of our students in that instruction, because that's what they need. It's what they all need.
And the
Yeah,
science,
we even have students we have English learners who are identified with a learning disability, and it's not a learning disability. It's not a mastery yet of language.
and a couple other questions came in the chat, Carolyn. So Jonathan was asking about, Orton Gillingham training is really expensive. So listen, we're not pushing a particular approach, but we know that if you teach to the science of reading, which involves explicit systematic instruction, that is beneficial for English learners. It is beneficial for students with disabilities. It's beneficial for everyone. And so there are lots of other ways to get that PD, not necessarily going through OG training, not because we love OG, don't get me wrong, it's great, but I learned how to explicitly and systematically teach children how to read before I learned OG. So there are other things that you can do, including some of the trainings that we're doing in this series are going to be really beneficial. We're not going to be able to, in 2 hours, go as in-depth as we'd like, but there's other things that are a lot less expensive out there, and we can share some ideas with you. And then there was a really concerning question about where the English learners are pulled to work on printing letters while the rest of the class works on flashcards. Well, here's the thing. Flashcards are not good. So
they shouldn't be doing that either.
So no one's getting help. Although printing, let me just tell you this. Printing is hugely important. Handwriting matters. Handwriting makes for better reading. Handwriting makes for better writing. Kids who are automatic and efficient with their handwriting have better written expression skills because it's less taxing on the brain to have to think about how to create letters. So it is a helpful skill, and it makes reading stick, it makes spelling stick, it makes writing better. All that being said. But we definitely don't want to pull kids from core instruction, number one. And number two, that shouldn't be all they're getting. Now, writing is a linguistic process, so they are getting some of that language help, but it's not enough. So I would hope there'd be more to it, although learning handwriting is super important. So honestly, know that at least they're getting something good out of it. The flashcard thing, that's opening up a whole other set of problems and all. So we could talk about that in another training, but that's opening up a whole other set of problems. I should probably pause the recording before I said that, huh? Whoops.
Yeah, let's stop the recording.